Hello everyone, welcome back to Unraveling Politics, a weekly political analysis show. Before we begin, if you're wondering what happened last week, apparently my computer ran out of disk space. I was trying to move it over from the video editing software to the computer and then to upload it, and it turns out there wasn't enough disk space. This computer is over 6 years old. The model came out 7 years ago, so it's definitely reaching the end of its life. So that's what happened. And I got it uploaded later in the day. It's the same episode. If you're wondering what that two-minute episode was all about, it was a corrupted file. So anyway, hopefully that will get us through the next few months because I've cleared about 60 gigabytes of space. So let's get into the week that was. This will be a very foreign policy-based episode because, as I will explain in a little bit, there's not much going on here at home politically. So the war is now 3 weeks old. And actually, no, it's 2 weeks old. It feels like it's 3 weeks. And there are no signs that it will end soon. We will begin with the oil markets, and the reason I put so much emphasis on the oil markets is because oil really runs our world. Even if you have an electric car and you have solar panels on your home, meaning you don't use oil or gas directly, nearly everything you buy is either made of oil or transported by oil in the form of gasoline and diesel. What is really alarming is the oil shock. And which, by the way, since last episode, oil was about $93 a barrel. That's when I recorded it. It swung up to $120, then it went down to $85, and then it closed up at about $99 on Friday, and then that is as far as I know, and who knows what it will be when you're listening to this. It has been so bad the U.S. has allowed Russian oil back onto the market, which obviously undermines peace in Ukraine. This will mean not only will the war in Ukraine likely go on even longer, but it means that U.S. gas prices are now on average at $3.63 a gallon, which is 50 cents more than it was a year ago. And this is the highest gas prices in about 2 years, in April, May of 2024. And there's no reason to believe they won't keep rising. Countries around the world have announced releases of 400 million barrels of oil, which is roughly 20 to 26 days worth of supply that would have gone through the Strait of Hormuz. About 15 to 20 million barrels go through it. The administration is telling other countries they need to help us secure the Strait of Hormuz where oil moves through, but I have a feeling that's not going to go anywhere until the conflict is over. And otherwise, our administration seems quite dismissive about the conflict. Pete Hegseth, our war secretary, told people not to worry about it. Trump says he will know the war is over when he feels it in his bones. And Iran's new supreme leader is saying the strait will remain closed for the foreseeable future. And I think the problem for Iran by closing it off is they are hurting the economies of Saudi Arabia, Iraq, the UAE, and Qatar. Not only to mention that these are very tourism-based countries and people don't want to travel to war zones. Speaking of Iraq, unfortunately, we have lost several more Americans. 6 of them died in a plane crash, which raises the death toll to 13 because we also lost a 7th U.S. service member who died on an attack in Saudi Arabia. That was a couple of weeks ago, but he recently died of his injuries. So the death toll to this war is now at 13. The most major development as of this recording is the bombing of a small island in the Persian Gulf called Karg Island, which has been an oil hub for the Iranian regime. We have not done a ground invasion as of this recording, and the problem with doing that is because it is an island, is once we invade it, if we did invade it, then we might not have a way to get out, and we might be leaving hundreds of troops stranded. And our embassy in Baghdad, Iraq, has been bombed. Israel has sent some weapons into Tehran, the capital of Iran, and Beirut, Lebanon. So it seems to me this war is spreading, and no matter what the administration says, this war is not ending anytime soon. So what are my thoughts on the war? Well, it will depend on if it is a success or not, and because I'm not quite sure what the objectives are. Trump, according to a statement from the White House on Thursday, said the objectives are to destroy Iran's missile capabilities, their capability to make new missiles, annihilate their navy, and prevent them from obtaining a nuclear weapon, as well as destroying Iran's ability to fund terrorists abroad. However, unlike the Bush administration in 2003, as I said last episode, there was no effort to lay the groundwork. Remember, the reasoning for invading Iraq was to stop the weapons of mass destruction that were never found. This sounds an awful lot like this. They even wanted to, quote, end Saddam Hussein's support for terrorism and free the Iraqi people, end quote. Trump said to the Iranians, the hour of your freedom is at hand. And then, unlike in 2003, it remains unclear if we want regime change within Iran. Bush obviously wanted regime change. We don't know this time because Pete Hegseth has said no, while President Trump has said yes. And if you ask me, the objectives are even less clear than they were in 2003, and the administration already said in June of last year that the nuclear capabilities of Iran has been completely obliterated. We as a country, including when Trump ran for president in 2015 and 2016, we said that we could never repeat the mistake that we made in Iraq. In fact, on February 15, 2003, that was the day the world said no to war, and that was a big anti-war demonstration. We really have not seen the same thing here. And as somebody who believed that the Iraq war was wrong, even though Saddam Hussein was a horrible leader, like the Iranian regime, I have to be against this war as well. And like most people, I want Iran to be a free country just as much as the next, but we've already tried that in Iraq and in Afghanistan and in Libya, and that has not yielded the fruits that we wanted. All right, so I started the show telling you there is not much going on here at home. There are two exceptions, one in Congress and one out in the country. We'll start with the Senate. This is the most important thing, and this is regarding a filibuster. John Thune, he has talked about the idea about the filibuster. He is saying we are not going to eliminate the filibuster, and because he says there's not enough support. He ran his leadership campaign in 2024, at the very end of 2024, to become the Republican leader, saying he wouldn't eliminate the filibuster. There's talk about a talking filibuster, and I think a talking filibuster is something to consider, although I do believe the filibuster is a good thing. 60 votes is what is needed. That would be 3/5 of all U.S. senators. The Democrats, they were the ones that last had 60 senators for about 6 months between 2009 and 2010. So really 60 is way too high, because when you have a threshold that's that high, you get very little legislation through that isn't budgetary. So I think it should be lowered to 55, or we should consider a talking filibuster. Maybe a talking filibuster and raising it to 2/3, or keeping it the way it is and lowering it to 55. So you might think, well, what is a talking filibuster? A talking filibuster is, as I will mention in a little bit, is something that would dramatically change how Senate business is through. And I do think one day, before we get on to that, I do think one day the filibuster will be completely eliminated. It's not in the Constitution. It is a Senate rule that can be removed theoretically by any party at any time for any reason. The problem is once it's gone, it's never going to come back, hence to get the hesitation to get rid of it. A talking filibuster would block all Senate business. This would mean no reopening of DHS, no confirmation of a new DHS secretary, no confirming of the roughly 60 judicial appointments that are waiting, including if a Supreme Court vacancy opens up, which I believe will happen later this year. There would be none of that. Every senator would get to speak twice during a session. So Democrats have 47 members. They would all get to speak, so 47 times 2, and then minus John Fetterman because he supports the SAVE Act, which would be what this whole argument is all about. And they could drag it out for weeks if they want, and if Republicans end the session for whatever reason, the clock starts all over again. So the idea with the talking filibuster is you would basically waste as much time as you can, run out the road, and then force it through. So I would prefer we don't do that, and we instead go to like 55 or something. What I'm concerned is the reasoning for pushing the Save America Act, which I've talked about before. The president talks about fraud in the coming midterms. There is no evidence that there will be any fraud. If Democrats win big, as they are expected to, and the Save Act is not passed, then they can claim it was rigged, and then we are down the whole 2020 election rabbit hole as we were 5.5 years ago. And as I said, Senator John Thune, he's the majority leader. He ran for the leadership on a mandate to keep the filibuster, but he's facing great pressure to remove it. And with only 9 months left in this Congress and about 6 months, a little more than 6 months until the election, Republicans might have a few things that they want to do before they're done, and before Democrats take over control of one branch, maybe both branches, in January of next year. And then next, I want to move on to the SAVE Act, which I've kind of already talked about. And if you don't know what that is, check out my video. I believe it was 2 or 3 weeks ago. And a lot has happened about it, and basically what you need to know here is that it will add voter ID restrictions, and Trump has vowed to veto all legislation until the SAVE Act reaches his desk, which would be an extreme move, and I don't think a president has ever done that before. However, I don't think this was actually going to happen. First, there is a government shutdown, more specifically Homeland Security is shut down. If a compromise passes through Congress, will he really let the department stay shut down? It's one of his favorite departments other than maybe energy. Then also consider not many bills are passing through Congress anyway. I'm gonna get to this in a moment once I talk about the special election in Georgia. There's very little to block, and then also say Congress does pass a bill that he supports. Will he really veto it or what? I mean, this is all bark and no bite. So the president really doesn't have much of a plan here. At least he's trying to get the SAVE Act through in any way he can, and he's not been able to do it. So there is a special election in Georgia. I hinted at this a couple of moments ago. It was to replace the former Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene in Georgia's 14th Congressional District. This is a seat in Northwest Georgia. It is a very conservative district. She won by like 37 points, so this is not a bellwether seat. I was watching a video on Fox News on YouTube because I don't have cable anymore, and they were basically saying like, oh, Georgia's going back to its roots. It's going to be ruby red. It's going to be a ruby red district, and it's going to show that Georgia is a Republican state. Except Georgia is a swing state these days, and this district in Georgia was always going to be a safe. There were 17 candidates on election night last week, and spoiler, it is headed to a runoff with a Democrat and a Republican, and if you add up all the Democrats and you add up all the Republicans, the margin between them is 60% for a Republican, 40% for Democrats, so it's about a 20-point gap, and therefore it is a 17-point overperformance. So it went from a 37-point win to a 20-point win. And my guess is that the 60-40 margin is going to tighten a little bit. We could see 59-41. We could see 58-42. It's not going to flip, but we could see the margin tighten a little bit. And that is what I think is going to happen here. Since there were so many candidates, that 20-point gap is really hard to measure. It's not a good way to measure it. The runoff is going to be in April. The Republican is going to win. And unless some crazy scandal breaks out between now and Election Day, this will be a Republican seat. It's going to be much relief to House Republicans. It's going to give them an extra seat to work with. It's going to bring the total back up to 218 to 214. So Trump and the Republicans can only lose one vote and pass legislation. And then this kind of time, you might think, all right, legislation, what are they working on? Well, other than the SAVE Act, very little. This is very reminiscent of, if you remember when I started the show back in 2024, I started it in May of 2024. There was very little going on even then, and that was because we were heading toward a presidential election. We are now in the zombie phase of a Congress. I kind of like to call the second session of Congress, which would be the one before the election, is very inconsequential. With the exception of the Save America Act, there is very little going through Congress except for maybe the odd budgetary bill, and in the Senate maybe a confirmation for a judicial appointment. In terms of acts signed into law, we are at just 79 since Trump came back to office. It might sound like a lot, but many of them were just resolutions, and they had very little effect. There are 51 actual laws, which is quite low, and some of the stuff doesn't even matter. For example, like Public Law 119 to 79, which just creates a time capsule for the commemoration of the 250th birthday of the country. It doesn't actually change anything. And in fact, the first year of this Congress, which was from January last year to January this year, the House recorded its lowest number of votes in a non-election year since the year 1991. So this Congress is going to be limping toward its conclusion in January 2027. And the irony is, Trump came into office claiming he had this powerful mandate to govern the country, and they haven't done all that much. It has been mostly via executive fiat, which once again, if and when Gavin Newsom becomes president, which I believe is where we are headed, that is all going to go away. So then we are going to shift to foreign policy. Trump announced, this is going to be one of the last things we talk about today. Actually, it is the last thing. We're going to try to have a little bit of a shorter episode this episode. And it is the Shield of the Americas, which includes a bunch of countries in the Western Hemisphere. And Kristi Noem, who was the Homeland Security Secretary, is now the Special Envoy. So she wasn't completely dismissed from the administration, but she was shuffled around. And the Shield of the Americas is a Trump foreign policy thing. The logo is really bad. I'll put it on screen for you to see. It looks very AI generated, and I wouldn't be surprised if it is. The inaugural summit was on March 7th, and countries included, it was Argentina, Bolivia, Chile, Costa Rica, the Dominican Republic, Ecuador, El Salvador, Guyana, Honduras, Panama, Paraguay, and Trinidad and Tobago. The signatories that weren't present at the event but are still in the Shield of the Americas are the Bahamas, Belize, Guatemala, Jamaica, and Peru. And if you're a Latin American observer, you will notice who is missing. Mexico, Venezuela, Colombia, Brazil, and Canada. They are all run by left-wing governments. So this shield is very right-wing ideologically. There are a few left-wing governments in there. There's a few tiny ones. I believe like Trinidad and Tobago. I believe they're run by a left-wing government, although it's not a super left-wing government like Venezuela. And because it is very ideological, it risks collapsing. Before we go into the politics of it, what is the Shield of the Americas? In short, it is a military and political alliance to deal with drug cartels in the region, more specifically to completely eliminate them. It's also known as the Americas Counter-Cartel Coalition. And in this, they will be sharing intelligence and coordinating operations with our own military to fight cartels. And I also add political alliance because Trump talked about at the summit, quote, keeping external threats at bay. And then he also said that this would include forces, quote, outside the Western Hemisphere. And obviously that's a jab at China. China has made inroads into the region for the last few decades, and that has been a problem for a very long time. We will see what happens, but there are many warning signs, one of which I already highlighted. Another one I'm concerned about is the huge holes in the coalition, as I already mentioned. And yes, we have worked with countries like Mexico to eliminate cartels and their leaders like El Muncho, who died a few weeks ago. He was killed in coordination with the Mexican government. So it might not be a big deal. However, cartels tend to operate cross-border, and there's no reason to think that cartels won't just enter another country outside the agreement. Mexico and Colombia, for example, are notorious for their drug problems. Colombia in particular is nearly where all the cocaine in our country comes from. So I briefly mentioned the ideological concerns, and that comes from the fact that Latin America tends to swing as a region in one direction and then rapidly toward another. It can often be very quickly. So, for example, in the 2000s, it swung more toward the left, and that was as commodity prices were booming. Things were going really well in Latin America for the most part. Venezuela was still a very rich country. So there was an idea we need to tax these companies, spread that money out to other people, and then it swung back toward the right in the 2010s, and that was as commodity prices were going back down. Especially if you think the collapse of oil prices in 2014, that was really bad for Venezuela. And then it swung back to the left at the tail end of the decade, and now it looks to be headed back to the right once more. And there are exceptions, of course, like Lula in Brazil and Sheinbaum in Mexico, but for the most part, Latin America is experiencing what they call a blue tide, and by blue we mean right wing. And eventually it will swing the other way. And when that happens, will this completely fall apart? Possibly. And not to mention, we might have a left-wing president in just 3 years, and then we could pull out of the alliance, and if we pull out, then the whole thing falls apart. And then lastly, the reasons for cartels is often because of crime, poverty, and corruption, which this is not going to do a thing about. This is not a aid package. I wouldn't have supported it anyway. We've done that already, and it didn't work. There's people who say, oh, we need a Marshall Plan for Latin America. No, we don't. We've already done that, and that has not worked. So this is a noble cause, in my opinion, but it is doomed to fail because it doesn't address the root problems of drugs, with the drugs, which is poverty, corruption, and crime in the region. And arguably, it's not our job to do that. This is not our country. We can focus on those things here. So I don't think this is actually going to work. It seems doomed to fail to me. So that is all for this episode. Thank you for tuning in. And as a reminder, if you are interested in the second edition of my book, it launches on Thursday, March 19th. If you didn't buy the first edition, if you already bought the first edition, then don't feel like you need to buy the second. But I thought I'd throw that out there. And as always, please let me know your thoughts in the comments below about the Iran war and everything else. So have a great week, and I'll see you next week. Bye-bye.